Hey, good morning, everyone. Talk about Throwback Thursday. That commercial aired way back, first aired way back in 1974, 47 years ago, when people thought it was cool to wear polyester. But as the saying goes, those who don't learn from history are what? Doomed to repeat it, right? Well, I sure hope we learn that polyester isn't cool figuratively or literally, because the last thing I want to be doing is standing here talking to you wearing a polyester leisure suit. It's not going to happen. Hey, good morning. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Garry. I'm one of the pastors here. Really glad that you've decided to spend some of your day with us this morning. A few weeks ago, I watched a really interesting documentary. And it was about McDonald's and Burger King and the burger war that ensued. Burger King had come along after McDonald's had already kind of established itself and thought, hey, this is a big market, we want to get in on it. And so they had these lofty dreams that they might even be able to kind of knock McDonald's off the top of the pyramid, so to speak. And so they thought, how can we do this? And what they did is they came up with the Whopper, which was so named because of its size. And I remember in the documentary, of course it was all reenactments, but I guess at the time that Burger King came out with this Whopper, the owner of McDonald's wasn't very happy. And it showed a video of him in his office with the little cheeseburger that McDonald's was offering at the time, and this massive Whopper. And the Whopper kind of did what Burger King wanted it to do. It started to draw people to the Burger King name. And so McDonald's, not wanting to be outdone, went to the drawing board and they came up with the Big Mac, complete with its 2 all beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. You remember that little jingle? But here's the thing, the Whopper wasn't the only weapon Burger King had in its arsenal. They also gave people the option to build their burger their way, hence the slogan, have it your way. I'd sing it, but I'd probably lose my job. But it was a brilliant strategy. So brilliant, in fact, that all kinds of companies have adopted this strategy. Why? Because it works. All of us like to have things our way. I mean, today, we can build and customize pretty much anything, from cars to computers, burgers to pizza, vacations to retirement plans, all so we can have it our way. And so the idea I want to throw this morning for you to kind of roll around and consider is this. I would suggest that we do the same thing when it comes to Jesus. Seriously, we do. Just like we can build our own burger or computer or car or whatever, we can build our own Jesus so we can have him our way. I did, still do if I'm honest, from time to time. But here's what I mean by that. Growing up, I created a Jesus that worked for me because, well, I like the idea that Jesus loved me, that he protected me, and cared about me. But there were some things I didn't like about Jesus. Some of the things he taught, and well, that was because it crimped my lifestyle. You know, and I wanted to do what I wanted to do when I wanted to do it. I mean, I was young. I wanted to live life and have it my way. And sometimes that bumped up against the teachings of Jesus. Like, don't drink too much wine, as a kid. Hey, just being honest. And so what did I do? I went down, I grabbed the old Build Your Own Jesus menu, and I went down and I started checking off the things I liked. Jesus, you're okay with the part where Jesus had some good moral teachings and some good lessons that, we'd be wise to follow, but the whole God thing, well, I'll just leave that out. That's kind of like leaving the onions off the burger. I'm not really into onions or mushrooms or whatever. I'm going to leave that part out. You've created your version of Jesus. Maybe you believe that Jesus is who he claimed to be. You've heard the Christmas story of when Jesus came to this earth through the virgin birth with Mary and all that. And you've heard and experienced enough in your life that, yeah, you believe and you trust Jesus and you're doing your best to follow him. Well, you have a version of Jesus. All of us have created a version of Jesus that works for us. So we can have him and have him our way. And just so you know, this whole build your own Jesus, this BYOJ, isn't anything new. People have been building their own personal Jesus since Jesus showed up on the scene over 2,000 years ago. In fact, we're going to look at a story this morning where we can see this whole BYOJ play itself out. In this story, we're going to look at 3 groups of people, all of who, just like you and just like me, had built their own version of Jesus. Here's how John, a close follower of Jesus, recalled the events of this day. Check this out. This is in the book of John, 4th book of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, chapter 12. And John writes, he says, news that Jesus was on the way to Jerusalem swept through the city. A large crowd of Passover visitors took palm branches and went down to the road to meet him. So just a couple of things there really quickly. Passover is arguably the biggest event on the Jewish calendar, still is. Back then, what they would do is at this certain time of year, around now, they would all, wherever they lived, they would all head to Jerusalem, descend on this, where the temple was, their capital, to celebrate what God had done with their ancestors when they delivered them from the hands of the Egyptians. And they remembered how the angel of death, would pass over the town. But those that had put blood on their doorposts and stuff, the angel of death would pass over them. And that's where they get the name Passover. And they still celebrate it to this day. And so Jerusalem went, from maybe a population of, 10,000 and just swelled. So all these Jews descended on it. That's what was happening. And Jesus was coming to town, and they wanted to honor him. They thought he was the Messiah. And we're going to get into that in just a second here. And so what they did to honor him is they took palm branches, tore them off the trees, and then laid them on the ground as he walked in. Hence the name Palm Sunday. That's why we call it Palm Sunday. Today's Palm Sunday. And as he came into town, they shouted, Hosanna, which in Hebrew means save us now. And again, we're going to talk about that in a second. And they would say, blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hail, King of Israel. And so the first group of people that we're going to see here that have created their own version of Jesus is the crowd. The crowd is fired up about the news that Jesus is on his way. Why? Well, because they had seen or heard about all the things Jesus had been doing the last 3 years that he'd been on the planet. For the last 3 years, Jesus had been crisscrossing the countryside, teaching this radical new way to live and relate to one another and to relate to God. And Jesus taught, about how we're to love not just our neighbor, which can be hard enough, but to love our enemies as well. I mean, that's pretty radical, isn't it? He taught how it's much better to take the high road, and if someone slapped you on the cheek, which was a massive insult back then, to not fight back, not to escalate the conflict, but to turn and give them the other cheek also. Ultra radical teaching. Who wants to do that? And he taught how it's better to demonstrate our love for others, especially our enemies, by walking the extra mile. Maybe you've heard that saying. You go the extra mile. Back then, a Roman soldier, and the Roman government was over, occupying Israel at the time. So the Israel nation was under occupation of the Romans. If a Roman soldier came up to you and said, you need to carry my gear, you had to do it, or there'd be horrible consequences. And it was a very degrading thing to do. And Jesus is saying, look, carry it the mile. After the mile, you were totally under no obligation. You could just drop the gear and you were done your duty. Jesus is saying, no, go the extra mile. Take it another mile. Radical stuff. Some in the crowd that day had also witnessed firsthand or had heard about these incredible miracles Jesus had done. And we've talked about some of those over the last few weeks. And when Jesus turned water to wine, when he restored sight to the blind and gave mobility to the lame and hearing to the deaf. They even heard stories about Jesus raising people from the dead. Last week, if you were with us, Russ, shared the story of when Jesus raised his friend Lazarus from the dead. I mean, that would have been pretty cool, wouldn't it? Check this out. This just a few verses later, John writes this. Listen to this. He says, many in the crowd had seen Jesus call Lazarus from the tomb, raising him from the dead, and they were telling others about it. No kidding. Could you imagine if you saw that? You come up to your buddy and say, man, you wouldn't believe it, Bob. It was crazy. I was there for the funeral. I knew Lazarus. He died. And we went to the funeral, and they put him in this cave, and they rolled this rock in front of it. And then 4 days later, Jesus shows up on the scene, and he says, roll the rock away. And everyone's like, well, it's going to stinketh. And he says, roll it away anyways. And then he said, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus came out. It was crazy. He was bumping all over the place because he couldn't see. But man, you should have seen it. It was incredible. John writes, that was the reason so many went out to meet him. Because they had heard about this miraculous sign. It's hard not to think or assume that most of the people in this crowd are more interested in what Jesus can do rather than who he is. For a lot of them, the Jesus they had built, he was like a Houdini. Add a little bit of miracle here and a little bit of wine there, and that's the Jesus I want. And you know what? You can't blame them, can you? How many of us haven't created a Jesus similar to that? One day we're cruising down this road called life, and we got Jesus sitting beside us in the front seat, and we got the tunes playing, and we're like, oh, life is good. But then the wheels blow off. And they blow off in some part of our life. Our finances blow apart. Our health falls apart. We get in a big fight with our spouse or significant other or our parents or a good friend. Suddenly our job's in jeopardy. Job we've had for years, and all of a sudden it sounds like we might lose it. And so what do? We turn to the Jesus that's sitting beside us, and we say, Jesus, help me. You got to do something, man. You got to fix this. Get me out of this. Help me. I need your help. But what happens? That Jesus looks at us and says, I can't. And we're like, what do you mean you can't? You're Jesus. I thought you loved me and you cared for me. You're supposed to look after me and take care of me. And Jesus looks back and says, I am Jesus, and I do love you, and I do care for you, but I can't. And so we ask why. And I'll suggest that the answer is because the Jesus we've created isn't real. It's not how Jesus works. And so we begin to doubt that he even exists. Think, this whole God Jesus thing isn't even real. He's not even helping me. Second group of people that we run into on this day that have built their own version of Jesus that wasn't really real are his closest followers, his disciples. The guys that have been hanging around him for the last 3 years, have walked with him, eaten with him, laughed with him, cried with him. They were expecting a king who would be a great military leader, who would throw off the yoke of the Roman government and establish God's kingdom by force. But Jesus, who claimed to be the Messiah, you even asked them, who do you think I am? We believe you're this. And he said, you're right. Even though they knew that, he was radically different from the Jesus that they had built. Jesus often talked with them, had really intimate talks with them about how even though he was the Messiah, he would be misunderstood, he would be betrayed, arrested, beaten, crucified on a Roman crucifix, worst horrible way to die. But then he would rise from the dead 3 days later. they didn't understand. It was like it did the big flyby right over their heads. They didn't even see it. Jesus found a young donkey and rode on it, fulfilling the prophecy that said, "Don't be afraid, people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming, riding on a donkey's colt." His disciples didn't understand at the time that this was a fulfillment of prophecy. It's easy for us from our perspective to look at that and go, how thick-headed were these guys? Like, how could they not get this? But we've got 2020. We can see the whole story. They're living it. John, the guy that's writing this, is writing this about himself. We didn't understand. We hadn't grasped who Jesus is. We had a picture of what we thought who we thought he is. We built that. But we didn't know who he was. We didn't understand until Jesus entered into his glory. And what John meant there was after Easter, after he'd been crucified, rose from the dead, and then ascended back to heaven, that's when they went, oh, now I see. But up until then, they didn't understand. Jesus' closest followers had built a version of Jesus that worked for them. But what it did in the end is it prevented them from seeing and understanding who Jesus really was and what his real mission was all about, which was to bring freedom, not just to the Jews, but to all mankind. And freedom, not from oppression of the government, but oppression from the sin that separates us from God. Then there were the religious leaders. Like everyone else, they too had built their own version of Jesus. And all I can say is if, there was such thing as a Jesus burger, theirs would have been pretty plain. It would have been pretty much bun and a patty. Why? Well, they didn't like very much about Jesus, so they would have left it all out. This event, when Jesus is riding into Jerusalem and the crowd is going crazy, saying, he's our guy, forced their hand. You see, ever since they first bumped into Jesus, they were on a collision course. They wanted to silence him because he was a threat. A threat to their position of power in the religious system, a threat to their position in the societal system. And so they were out to get him. And they tried and tried and tried, and every time they tried, they got thwarted. And now here he is, coming into the capital city, the biggest celebration of the year, and people are flocking to him. It says, then the Pharisees said to each other, there's nothing we can do. Look, everyone has gone after him. And so the pressure is on for them to do something, to finish this Jesus off once and for all. They had created a Jesus that was a threat. Here's the thing. This is really sobering to admit. But of all the people in this story, the crowd and the closest followers and then these religious guys, it's the version that these religious guys kind of built of Jesus, that he was a threat, is the one I kind of resonate with the most. Just being honest. Because Jesus, for a lot of time, he was a threat to my lifestyle, my popularity with my friends. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, as a young man, I liked the idea that Jesus loved me and protected me, and I liked all that stuff, but I didn't like some of the stuff he taught because it crimped my lifestyle, and I wanted to do what I wanted to do when I wanted to do it. And it didn't take long for me to begin to see Jesus as a threat to all of that. And what's the best strategy for getting rid of a threat? It's eliminating it, right? And that's what I began to do. I began to cut Jesus out of my life so I could distance myself from him. So when I went out and did the things that I knew I probably shouldn't be doing anyway, but I wanted to, at least I didn't have to feel bad about it. Anyone else relate to that at all, at any level? Just me? Thankfully, Jesus didn't do the same to me. He didn't cut me off or cut me out of his love. Not even close. What he did is he waited patiently. He waited patiently for this self-centered, selfish, messed up prodigal to turn around and come home. And he does the same for all of us, for you. No matter what you've done or haven't done, he's waiting. The whole purpose of this Who series is so simple. And it's when we launched this, it was all about how important it is to know who Jesus is. So you can make a decision one way or the other about him. Like, I want to follow him. I think I know who he is. To no, not into it at all. But at least come to that place where you can make a decision. And the best way to do that is to dig into his life and check out these claims that he made about himself to see if they're true, to see how they line up. And as we do that together, we can learn to trust him more, hopefully learn to trust him more with our entire life. So if you're here and you're still building your own Jesus, be sure to add this ingredient: humility. Jesus came riding into a town humbly on the back of a beast of burden, a donkey. You see, at the time, it was customary at the time for war heroes, army generals, newly crowned kings, conquering kings, to ride into a city on a white stallion with crowds shouting adoration and throwing down palm branches. And how did Jesus enter? On a lowly donkey. And the donkey was ridden as a symbol of peace. Jesus is often referred to not only as the King of Kings, but the Prince of Peace. And we see that here. And I can't help but see how he entered Jerusalem that day as a great picture of how Jesus enters into our lives if we allow him. Humbly, gently, peacefully. If you really want to dive in and get a good picture to see who Jesus is, you only need to fast forward a few days from this day to Thursday. 4 days later, on Thursday of that week, that was the day Jesus gathered with his closest friends for one last meal. We refer to it now as the Last Supper. And so he gathered together with them. And he knows that on this night he's going to be betrayed. He's going to be arrested. The next day he's going to be found guilty on these trumped up charges. And he's going to be beaten and executed on a Roman cross. And with all of that horror, all of that pain just mere hours away, what does Jesus do at this meal? He got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet. Not only that, drying them with the towel he had around him. Jesus didn't barricade the doors. He didn't grab anything and everything that could be used as a weapon to hold off the Roman soldiers when they came to arrest him. No, he washed his disciples' feet. The Creator God, the God that created everything, washed the very people he created. He washed their feet. Man, if riding in on a donkey wasn't humbling enough, this act of servitude certainly was. In fact, one of his close followers, a guy we talk about a lot around here, Peter, this rough, gruff fisherman, tried to stop him, saying, "You can't do this." This is also the meal where Jesus took two very common items. He took bread and he took wine. And he used them as symbols to represent what he was about to do, which was to give himself as a sacrifice once for all, to bridge the gap between humanity and God. In essence, it was the first communion. Something that around here we do once a month. Because Jesus said, look, if you do anything, I want you to do this on a regular basis. Just remember what I did for you. I mean, with all the pomp and pageantry around Christmas, you'd think Jesus said, remember my birth. But he didn't. He said, remember my death. Remember what I did for you. That's what makes grace so amazing, is when we remember that. And so we're going to celebrate and remember and reflect now together. And so I would invite you to take whatever you're using, crackers or bread and your juice, so we can just take some time to remember Jesus. And add these elements in. Like if we're going to build a Jesus, let's build the real Jesus. One that's humble, peaceful, loving, kind, gentle, sacrificial. As they were eating, Jesus took some bread and he blessed it, and then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take this and eat it, for this is my body." And then he took a cup of wine and gave thanks to God for it. And he gave it to them and said, "Each of you drink from it, for this is my blood, which confirms the covenant between God and his people. It is poured out as a sacrifice to forgive the sins of many." And so I would just invite you to take a few moments to do that now. Have it your way. It seems to be the secret sauce to being happy. You know, at least when it comes to burgers and cars and computers and things like that. But building our own version of Jesus to follow, what that does is it actually prevents us from experiencing the abundant life that he came to help us live, that he has for each one of us. And so when Jesus invites us to follow him, he's inviting us to follow him as he really is. Not a version of Jesus that we've made up that seems to suit our needs and works for us. And if we choose to do that, that's when we'll begin to experience a life like no other. I'm really glad that I get to be a part of this journey with you. I invite you to pray with me. God, it can be so easy for us to want to follow, but sometimes following means maybe, giving up some of the things that we really like to do, but maybe aren't the best thing for us. And so we try and create a picture of you that kind of works for us. But when we really read through the biographies, the first four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we get such a great picture of what you're like. You're so gentle and kind and loving and forgiving and merciful. But you're also holy and just in the most perfect way. And so I just pray for each one of us that we would just take time this week to go down that list and see what we've not only included, but the things that we've left off. Because the best thing we can do is follow the real you. And so give us the courage to do that, eyes to see that. Thank you for your patience, your grace, your mercy, and your love and your forgiveness that you pour out to us every single day. And we pray this in your most awesome name. Amen.